So I'm in Hong Kong today with Minnie vanderPol from Baker and McKenzie, a partner here who has a fascinating life. You'll have already heard her bio by now, but I just know that you'll find this a fascinating conversation. So thank you, Minnie, for taking part in this series, Asia in the West.
Thank you, Susan.
So my first question of you is, when we talk about conversations taking place between Asia and the West, what does that mean? What does it bring up to you?
Sure. I actually always find that a very interesting concept because it almost presupposes that Asia is this homogeneous one continent of people.
And the West as well.
Yeah. Exactly. And
crazy.
It doesn't work that way. I mean, I'm of Indian heritage. I was born in India but raised in Australia and now living in Hong Kong. I'm Asian, but you know, the person next to me could be Asian in a completely different way. So therefore, you know, I think one of the things when we talk about having conversation is taking the time to get to know the people that you are wanting to have that conversation with. And part of that is being interested, genuinely interested. Putting aside some of those assumptions and stories and media information or sitcoms or movies or whatever it is, and actually just get to know the people that you need to understand, to communicate with, to do business with, to learn from, etc. So Asia is really quite complex. You know, living in Hong Kong and seeing the influence of China in Hong Kong from a political and social perspective has been mind-opening for me, because when I was living in Australia, I had no idea about all those intricacies. My husband works for a tour company. He shows and introduces tourists that come into Hong Kong, and some of the tourists coming from the US ask questions like, so what's the main difference between China and the US? They don't have any concept of what is communism. They don't, you know, he tries to break it down by saying, well, in China you don't have Google. You know, he explains it in a way that they need to understand, and I think this is part of the problem. I mean, I'm glad that they are traveling, those people, because by traveling and by asking questions, as silly as they may seem, they're at least learning. And that's really what we need to do in order to have a true discussion.
So it's interesting that, in fact, as you say, at least these people are getting themselves over here. They leave behind a very large percentage of the Western population that in many cases doesn't have a passport.
Yeah.
So one of my questions was going to be of you, how well does the West understand this culture, however large and varied it can be? And I think your sense is not too well.
No. And that means that there's a lot more suspicion. So when we look at the political climate between the US and China, I think a lot of that is built on suspicion and lack of understanding. Of course, there's always going to be economic factors, but the fact that Donald Trump is now looking to create relationships with Russia, where the Cold War was something that suggested that would never happen, means that, of course, relationships are always possible from an economic standpoint. But I think the problem with the Western lack of understanding of Asia is that it results in a lot of suspicion, uncertainty, feeling of fear. The China aspect obviously doesn't play into the Muslim issue. However, there is still this lack of understanding, and somehow they're so different from us that we cannot work together.
So what about the other way around?
Yeah.
How well does Asia,
Yeah.
that big monolithic, and how well do Asians understand the West?
I think they're putting a lot more effort into doing so. So they're sending their students out to the world, whether it's to Europe or to Australia or to the US, Canada, and they're telling them, you must learn, because there's a lot of good things that you can learn and bring back. So, for example, Prime Minister Modi, in relation to India, has made it very easy for Indians that have left India and have gone to other countries and made their lives there to come back, to invest, to work, to contribute, to bring back their learning and actually use it for the benefit of India in the future. And I suspect that that has played a part in India's economic boom. It is doing a lot better, and there is, I went to the World Economic Forum in Delhi last year.
Oh, right.
And I had gone to the 2014 one, December, but I'd missed 2015, and then I went to last year. And the difference was amazing. So
really?
In 2014, there were a lot of government ministers attending panels. Many of them didn't speak English. They were sort of, I would call sort of unsophisticated. And their understanding of what their part was to the success of India was difficult to understand. The change between 2014 to 2016 was amazing. We suddenly had ministers and government representatives who were articulate, who had strategic vision. They were talking about innovation in a way that I hadn't heard from particularly the government sector, but talking with the private sector and just working out ways that they could actually work together on the podium, on panel sessions. It was extremely impressive. And I see a lot of that coming from education. The fact that English is really the national language. I mean, Prime Minister Modi would like Hindi to be, but really it's English because it unifies the whole of the country. The fact that so many of these individuals have gone out into the world, learnt and come back, and they're still learning. They're wanting to learn. They're not suggesting that India has all the answers. And that's where Western countries, I think, we have this superiority that we know everything and there's nothing for us to learn from the emerging markets or developing countries. We've got to stop that kind of concept, because frankly these developing countries, so-called, are leading the way.
They're already developed,
Yeah,
actually.
exactly.
Yeah, in fact, maybe moving beyond where many people had even an inkling of that. So one of the things I was going to ask is, how has the conversations that we're talking about, how they have changed over the last several years? And that's a great example, certainly from India. How about China? Do you see the same sort of thing happening with the same impact? So, yeah, how does that compare to what's happening?
Yeah, so China, it is slightly different, because I think China's still grappling with, they want to learn and they want to benefit, but the difference really is how much freedom they're willing to allow their people to have in order to be the best that they can be. Because freedom and political control may not sit so comfortably. And I think China's really grappling with that, because the internet is at the heart of a lot of innovation. But by cutting their citizens from being able to access all that it has to offer, may be curtailing some of the opportunities.
That's a losing game anyway, though, isn't it? I mean,
Exactly.
how much can you control
That's right.
over time?
That's exactly right. And so I think the difficulty for China will be willingness to open up and trust their citizens who have a true love of the country. And I actually think they do. I mean, we do a lot of work in China, and we've got offices in Shanghai and Beijing, a lot of our team members are Chinese, they have a deep love of the country and they can see that the opportunities are great for them.
Now, has that shifted at all with the recent downturn?
No, because there's a couple of things that the downturn. I think the downturn demonstrates that there's always room for improvement, and there's no perfection in the strategy that was set, and they need to relook at the way that they're going to approach. And they need to be a little bit more transparent in terms of what they're trying to achieve. Because I think part of the problem was all we saw were the good results. It was very difficult to understand what the true strategy was behind those results, and how much of those results perhaps were based on, let's put it, certain level of optimism rather than reality. And we've seen that in terms of some of the businesses that have failed or that have suffered deep financial losses. So another reason that people will give is the battle in terms of dealing with the corruption issues in China. So that's where we, in terms of what I do.
That's close to you.
Yeah. And a lot of the West will say, oh, it's all politically driven. That China's only done this to get rid of bad apples.
You mean their anti-corruption campaign?
Correct.
Yeah. Do you agree with that?
I don't. I don't. I'm sure that just as the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US, has a certain level of political will in there, I'm sure that the China anti-corruption measures also have a certain level of political impetus. But I actually think that they genuinely wanted to reduce corruption because they could see that it was holding them back. What people don't understand is the price of corruption. People think of it as, sure, monies are going into the wrong hands and people are getting unfair advantages, but actually the level of money that disappears from a business and it's off the books, so nobody ever does a analysis as to how that affects the bottom line or the margins, and what the impact is if it's not assessed. By making this culturally acceptable to operate with reduced, nobody's ever going to eradicate corruption, but with reduced corruption in their business model, it actually is economically a very good strategy. And I think you're going to see the benefits of that going forward, rather than getting a government contract by paying multi-millions of dollars or RMB. There's now a more even playing field, and hopefully, the right businesses will be winning those contracts for the right reasons. So that means there'll be greater efficiencies. It means that there'll be probably cost savings, and there isn't that leakage of money disappearing into somebody's hands.
Well, you're pretty close to all this. Is it working?
I am seeing a marked improvement in being able to say no. So when I have clients who grapple with government officials in China, today I can find measures for them to withstand those pressures, say no to those demands, and if they continue to be pressured, we can go up the line. We can take those complaints to a high level.
That's totally new, right?
That's totally new. Because it's so in the media. I mean, China has been very active in making sure that everybody knows about it.
And so everybody in every village now with an iPhone knows that they can record what their local officials are doing, right?
And they have rewards. I mean, we talk about whistleblowing rewards coming out of the US. There's a lack of understanding that actually the number of whistleblowing incentives in China is quite amazing. And the protection for whistleblowers against retaliation is unprecedented.
Really?
There is nothing like that in the US or in any other country that I'm aware of. They have enacted laws, regulations, and they've enforced them so that if somebody retaliates against a whistleblower, or they retaliate against a whistleblower's family member, or somehow even if they're not terminated from employment, their situation might be diminished. That is all actionable.
Really?
So,
And enforced.
and enforced.
Wow, so that really is a big change. So what about, that sounds like you were also suggesting in there, or maybe I was hoping to read into it, that it leads to more innovation, that it encourages people. Now, am I right about that?
I certainly think that it is open for that. I haven't got any evidence to suggest that one thing is adding up to the next, only because we've had such little time. So this whole anti-corruption strategy has been relatively, it's
new,
young. It's
yeah.
about 5 years.
If that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. So therefore, I haven't got any suggestions or any evidence to say that it certainly has done so. But I think it opens itself up for that.
So, Minnie, we do know, though, that there's all kinds of innovation coming out of China now,
Absolutely.
even though Westerners aren't necessarily appreciative of that, or even know about it. But it's obvious to anybody that spends any time here. So, where is that coming from? I remember it wasn't that long ago that sitting in conversations here in Hong Kong, people would say, well, China and innovation, it's a problem because their educational system at the lower levels just does not lead to independent thinking. It's all by rote, so they're going to have a problem. Well, they're still teaching their kids by rote, as I understand it, and they're somehow innovating. Where is it coming from? Is it homegrown, or is it coming from all those people going to the West and coming back and sharing that kind of thinking? It's certainly not expats, I don't think, because there aren't that many that are really influencing the way they used to. What's the story?
I think it's a bit of both. I think their education system is not, it has evolved. Yes, they still learn by rote, as do most Asian countries, because they believe that a certain level of information needs to be put into the minds of young people. But I think they're encouraging education to be broader. So they're not limiting education to be simply with the books. They are, developing opportunities for them to have practical exposures.
Like what?
And I was just going to add to that, and although you said the expats may not have a great deal of influence, there's a number of NGOs operating in China who I think have had some tremendous influence. So an area that I know a little bit about is in terms of environmental sustainability. And the reason I know it is only because my eldest son is doing environmental engineering, and he went to China on a tour of various facilities that they had developed to provide sustainable opportunities in rural areas. And he was blown away.
Really?
By the work that these NGOs were doing and what it was giving to farmers and to the local people in terms of better water quality, farming practices, and a number of other initiatives that he had learned about at university. He's only in his third year. He's got one more year to go. So, he's obviously at a very early stage, but was still very impressed at what he could see.
And are those NGOs operating in the absence of, we're doing this because the government hasn't taken steps, or is this all happening at once? Is the Chinese government as well engaged?
The Chinese government is very much
That's my
behind
understanding.
a lot of these projects and are encouraging and putting money. So that's part of it. So when you talk about, where's the innovation coming, it's the resourcing. So where a lot of our NGOs in other, particularly coming out of the West, are often starved for funding, or it's sort of, really trying to eke out the ability to do some of those projects. China has the ability to fund these things, and they are funding, and I think that makes a big difference to innovation.
Mm. So where does Hong Kong come into all this? I'm interested, especially because people have talked to me over the last year or two. It's almost as if it's blind people describing an elephant, depending on what they think of the future of Hong Kong. Depends on where they stand. So where do you come out on all that? What's the future for Hong Kong, especially given the last several years of stress and trouble over its role within Greater China?
I think, again, we're going to have to wait and see a little bit, because I'm very new to Hong Kong, so it's now...
How long have you been here?
2.5 years.
Okay.
So I feel like I'm very much a novice in terms of understanding Hong Kong. What I love about Hong Kong is that it really is one of the very few places that I've seen where East and West are in this melting pot. Singapore has almost stripped away all its Eastern aspects and is now this bright and shiny thing, whereas Hong Kong still has all of its dark little corners and interesting laneways and its people, and there is still a love of the Hong Kong culture being allowed to shine. But you've got to remember, Hong Kong, of course, has a culture made up of, the Punjabis who came as policemen for the British. You've got expats, you've got new expats, old expats, you've got the Chinese nationals, you've got, it's just such a mixture of cultures and people originating from very many different countries. The influence of China is everyone's just trying to work out, well, how's this going to play out? A lot of the protests that we've seen for democracy has been quite interesting, but it's a mixture of different tensions. There is certainly the element of wanting Hong Kong to be democratic and therefore be different to China. I'm not sure that's going to happen, simply because it is part of China, and unless it happens in China, it's not going to happen in Hong Kong. But the second aspect, though, is Hong Kong's always been a business. I've always seen Hong Kong as more of a bank or a corporation. It's been run that way, and it's been allowed to prosper and create wealth and opportunities for its people. And so the young people in Hong Kong today say, well, hang on a minute, where is that for me? Because that opportunity is not as readily available. Property prices are huge.
Hugely high.
For a young person without a major family support, they can't afford to buy, an apartment.
Even rent one.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so they're saying, hang on, I've been sold a lemon because you told me if I went to school, studied really hard, went to university, got a great degree, got a good job, that these opportunities would be for me, and they're not. So I think somehow we've got to find a way for Hong Kong to redress that balance, because otherwise you're going to have those millennials leaving, frankly. And in fact, what we've seen is there has been a much bigger exodus.
And where do they go?
Well, people say they go back to, because if you remember, at the time of the handover, a lot of people were given visas or permanent residency for Canada, the UK.
That's true.
And so a lot of the families are either, some parts of the family are still there, some people came back, some people stayed. So they're going back to those countries where who gave them refuge. So yeah, there are a lot going to Australia, I know that for a fact, and Canada, the UK, and I suspect the US.
So how about China itself, mainland China? There are some sources that say that some of China's wealthiest and brightest are actually exiting mainland China. Do you see that?
I'm not sure I see it in where I'm sitting, because a lot of companies we act for are attracting some amazingly talented people to come and work for them.
In mainland China.
In mainland China. Now, there are some problems in terms of that. Some people just don't want to live in China, and that's more about the pollution rather than, and you know, the impact on your health and your children. So families, you know, that's a big decision if you choose to move to Beijing, because unfortunately that is a big concern. So a lot of people are actually living in Hong Kong and working in mainland China. If you look at the air routes between Hong Kong and Shanghai, Beijing and other parts, or the train, the commuting that's going on is quite...
It's been good for Cathay.
Very good for
Yeah,
Cathay, exactly.
yeah.
So China has to deal with that. That's the biggest elephant in the room. They're dealing with corruption, and I think... but the environmental issues are significant, because it could be a game changer.
So are you ultimately bullish on China?
I'm less, I wouldn't suggest bullish. I'm suggesting that China has not yet realized its potential, and I think the potential is significant.
And when you say that,
Yeah.
potential in what?
In a number of aspects. Economically, I think they may have had a couple of backward steps, but I think they are intelligent enough to learn from that, and we're already seeing some positive signs. I think if they trust their citizens in order to allow them to innovate, allow them to learn, allow them to develop a bit more freely, I think the potential is huge, because, you know, this is a group of people who, if they already have significant ability to work together as a team, you know, India can really learn a lot.
I was just going to ask you, what's the contrast here?
Yeah, the contrast is India is just billions of people that are individuals. And if something...
There's that democracy thing.
If something works, it's almost happenstance rather than good planning. But that is also changing. I think we're seeing a little bit of that, but we'll come back to that. Yeah. So China already has that ability to gather people together. Sure, it could be because of communism, and it has a way of doing that. But that's not a bad thing. It can mean things get done. It can mean that rather than talk about it,
they take action.
They actually take action, and if they make a mistake, they need to figure out, okay, how do we adjust? How do we go back? Rather than in the old days, if there was a mistake, then there was a cover up, or there'd be lack of transparency, and somebody to be punished, etc. But I think, you know, if they are prepared to sort of embrace a more open culture, but still retain that ability to get people to harness the will, the action of the people, I think there is a great deal more potential.
So the challenges that could be the hiccup, you mentioned the environmental one, that they need to solve that. Secondly, it sounds like the relationship between the government and its people, how there's a transaction there that the people allow the government to sort of speak for them so long as they continue to feel that they'll be richer and better off than they were yesterday.
Yeah.
Is there any other big potential challenge that China faces in this thing going ahead? What about their healthcare system and the aging population? How critical is that?
Yeah, no, but that they actually share that with a number of countries.
That's true.
It's not a uniquely China issue. That's something that we are all grappling with.
That's true, isn't it?
And often very badly. So, yes, there's a number of other elements of their social and infrastructure that will need to continue to evolve. But you know, that's one thing that I see. My mother-in-law came to Hong Kong for a visit. She's 88 years old. What she was blown away by was the respect that she got, that she feels is completely lacking in Australia. She's not even talking about people standing up to give her a seat on a bus or anything like that. She's actually talking about people, you know, when she's walking. She had a hip replacement, so her walking was not so great, but she had to walk because we were, wanting her to recuperate. She's back playing tennis, by the way.
Great.
Anyway, but when she was here in Hong Kong, people were respectful and moved to one side to allow her to pass, but they were friendly in doing it. There were people that would smile, you know. She felt she was listened to. People would make eye contact. And in Australia, you know, her experience has been so negative. She's been to hospitals where the medical people will talk, and it would be like she's just a piece of meat on the bed because they don't talk to her. They don't ask her. They make assumptions right there in front of her. And she finds it extraordinarily frustrating. You know, she feels that the bureaucracy, they're trying to get rid of her license, so that, you know, they want to stop her from driving. They want to, you know, all those sort of things.
Interesting.
Without the pluses. Whereas in Hong Kong and in China,
The respect for
there is a great,
elders.
yeah. And if again, I think that that's something that China should make sure that it doesn't lose, because while it struggles with an aging population, it's going to make it a lot easier if people, if they struggle together and they seek the input of elderly people as to what they want.
So let's look at India now. How bullish are you about India's future? That messy democracy that it is.
Yeah. I'm a bit more bullish because I've seen some really dramatic changes that I never thought I would see. So
Really?
The introduction of the goods and services tax is, in my view, something that is a very good change.
What has happened as a result of that?
Well, no, we haven't seen the result of that, but the fact that we're going to
Have
have
it.
it is a major change, because so that, together with the demonetising policy that Modi has introduced, is his way of trying to grapple with corruption. He can't do it in the same way as China, because you can't just snap your fingers and everything goes the way that you want it to go in India, of course. However, he's taken steps that are pretty dramatic and, again, unprecedented, and have caused a huge amount of disruption. Disruption right down to the basic level of rickshaw drivers having to open up a bank account. But I've been reading all these interviews and vox pops that have come out of India, because I'm fascinated by this, where the same rickshaw driver says, yes, I know, it's been a pain, there's not been small change. I've got family members there, and you've been having to queue up to open these bank accounts, etc. But the same rickshaw driver says, but I think he's done the right thing.
Really?
Yes.
So he's got
Yes.
backing from the population.
And apparently, if you believe what's in the media, he will be re-elected despite the amazing
Disruption
and it has. I mean, you can imagine. There's not enough people manning banks to be able to open these bank accounts. They can't print the new notes fast enough to get it out into circulation. It's quite crazy, and it does, in fact, it impacts the small businesses. But at the same time, if he hadn't done that, the prospect of India succeeding and continuing to grow would have been much slower.
So what are the challenges for India that could get in the way of this future growth?
So he's taken some steps. He's taken, other steps in terms of putting a lot of permits and licenses online, so that there's less ability to have to pay bribes to get things done. Okay, so some of those things are really good, but he hasn't done enough in terms of anti-corruption. He has to have a law that works. At the moment, there is a law, but it's not being enforced. There's been talk, and there's a draft of something that's very akin to the UK Bribery Act, but it hasn't yet been passed and put into. And it's not about just having a law. He needs to also put the resources in to have a proper regulator who will enforce
it.
There'll be fines, there'll be jail time, because unfortunately people need to understand what the consequences are in order for them to change the way they behave.
It's a real behavioral change.
Yeah. And at the moment we've got clients who are still struggling about, well, I've got a better story today than I did 5 years ago with them, and there are a number of things we can do, but it's not nearly the story that I would like to be able to give.
So is there anything we haven't talked about that is on your mind or that you think should be included when we talk about this Asia and the West opportunity?
What I've also seen in Hong Kong is not in every country in Asia, but in some countries I'm seeing the woman's voice being heard in a way that I was more frustrated about in Australia. And I thought that was interesting. So for many countries in Asia, there is more support for women to be able to go back into the workplace, because there are helpers available. There's, that's a whole issue in itself, Susan. But
it is indeed.
But there's also family support. Because a woman who has gone and had a university education, who then says, now I'm going to stop working and look after the children, the community looks askance at that. And a lot of, unfortunately, the same social pressures, it's entirely the opposite in Australia, where people look askance at a woman who's decided to go back to work and leave her children in the care of a nanny or a childcare centre. So Asia has this ability to perhaps more quickly tap into the skills and the contribution of women that I suspect they could be more successful at that than
the West
countries. Yeah.
So what you're saying is that, in fact, unlike Australia, people look askance when a woman gives up this profession. And really, now is that true in Japan as well?
No, that's
the one exception.
Exactly, Asia is not alone.
Yeah, because
that's right. There are many countries where that's going to be a much bigger change that's going to be required.
But we're talking about a pretty big part of the world, if that's an issue.
And I'm talking about China, I'm talking about India,
a lot
I'm
of
talking
manpower.
about Hong Kong, and these are the countries I know best.
Yeah.
But I know working with my colleagues in Singapore, Malaysia, I see women in senior positions, positions of power and influence, and they're being valued and they're allowed to prosper, and that's capital that that could be a game changer just in itself, and it's an area that's very passionate to me.
Well, me as well. I mean, that once again, it could be that Asia takes the lead on something that's been argued about and discussed and fought over, but a lot of people feel hasn't made that much progress in the West. So I have one last question of you, and that is something that's just come up recently, the fact that the South China Morning Post has appointed a new CEO since Jack Ma and his company Alibaba bought the South China Morning Post. What do you think about that as an institution? And does it sound like this idea of bringing in technology sound really hopeful in terms of that being a voice, a source of news that people in the rest of the world will appreciate?
Yeah, I have to say that it was, I certainly subscribed to the South China Post when I first moved here 2.5 years ago.
And you said that in the past tense, so that's,
It's
like...
then I gave it up because unfortunately the way that the paper, it had very little to offer me, and I wasn't quite convinced that it was providing a complete picture, or at least as complete as I would like it. So,
or one not influenced by mainland China.
correct,
Mm-hmm.
correct. So if this change is going to bring a real change, to provide us with greater opportunity to be aware of what is occurring in a more neutral way, I'd be really interested, because I think this is, that's another difference with Asia. In many countries here in Asia, the newspaper is still valued. People will buy the newspaper and read it,
If they feel it's a true source
correct,
of,
correct.
Yeah.
And you only have to look in India. I think there are more newspapers published in India than you could ever find in almost any other country.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't notice that.
Yeah,
Okay.
and and people still buy the newspaper every morning, and in fact they'll buy several. And you've got broad offerings, and I think that is it's interesting, because there is a very open, unbiased media who are willing to report anything and everything. Now that could be good and bad, but you're certainly not getting a politically sensitized version. So if the South China Post, that could be a way of this trust that I was talking about. If Jack Ma is allowed to run a paper, if his editor is allowed to speak freely, that could be a really
Could be huge.
amazing way of making that change.
And also, because it's here in Hong Kong, it gives another power base to Hong Kong that would be certainly, I think, strengthened if it becomes the global vehicle that I think it could be. Because people in the West, as we said very early, they weren't, they're not as informed as they should be. So this is a good place to stop, perhaps. The perfect timing. This has been just fascinating to me, Minnie. Thank you so much for participating in this Asia in the West podcast series, and I hope we'll continue this conversation at some point.
Thank you, Susan. I appreciate the opportunity and to catch up with you.
Great. Thank you. That was great.